right. Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny Hughes, founder of the Brave Trauma Therapist Collective, and I'm so excited to host my first interview on my YouTube channel. I'm joined by Khara Croswaite, and she is here because one of the amazing readers of my newsletter reached out to me a few weeks ago. I had just shared the story about what it was like when my dad died during the COVID pandemic, and how for me as a therapist, what it was like to go back to work literally 7 days later and kind of have to pretend like nothing had happened. And so one of my readers reached out and shared their own story of losing a dear client and asked if I could talk about this topic. And I am not an expert in that area, but Khara is. And so I reached out to her, asked her if she would share some of her valuable time with us, and she is so generously doing that. You all have submitted questions, so we're going to get to those because they are direct from what you all are needing here on this channel. And we're just going to dive right in. So, Khara, can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your work, and then we'll get started?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for asking about this topic. Like, I'm all in all the time about this because it needs to be talked about. So, for your audience, just knowing I'm a serial entrepreneur, I have lots of hats I wear. I'm an LPC here in Colorado. But for this video, I'm really putting on my confidential grief specialist hat. So, confidential grief by definition means that we can't talk about loss with our clients because one, client work is confidential. But this term specifically showed up for client suicide. And I know there's lots of other kinds of losses. So, I've written a book on this topic. It's coming out in hopefully early 2026. We'll see publishers doing their thing. And the book's called The Resilient Therapist because, like, how do we come back from these significant losses or what we call career traumas of mental health? So, happy to be here answering all the questions in whatever way I can to support our community because it's pretty darn hard to do alone.
It is. I mean, and when we lose clients, I lost a client earlier this year, someone I was actively working with. I
Mm.
also, um, it was kind of near the end of the pandemic. I learned about a previous client of mine that had died very tragically and suddenly in an accident. One of my former colleagues reached out to let me know. And I've lost a couple other clients in other ways as well. And yeah, we can't talk about it. I mean, we can't, HIPAA and all of that no matter what in our work, but then it's normalized to go to consultation and ask how to help a client with X, Y, and Z problem, but there's no normalizing of talking about losing our dear clients. And so I'm just so grateful for the work that you do.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely not easy. I will say that I had an exposure to losing a client 3 months into the job. So, like,
Wow.
I'm now 15 years in the field. And so I was just recognizing that as you were sharing just now, Jenny, of like, I think that's one of the many reasons I'm a person who wants to talk about this. I've had more significant losses since then when it comes to client work. And so definitely have the lived experience for better or worse to be like, yes, this is something a lot of us are navigating, but are not talking about because there's no
Mhm.
safe place yet. Power of the word yet. We're going to work on that.
Exactly. Exactly. All right, well, let's dive in. So, Kara has no idea what these questions are. We had agreed to just
Nope.
sort of keep it a secret, and they're really, really good.
Oh, like no pressure. Like, okay, I'm ready.
So, the first sort of general theme, we've started talking about it a little bit. It's what this reader wrote into me about and asking about kind of generally addressing the topic on losing a client. And this person shared that they're so afraid it's going to happen again. Right.
Mm.
They were so incredibly impacted by the loss of their client. It was in a sudden and pretty tragic way. And now they had to go back to work literally one day later. They took one day off and they're just so afraid it's going to happen again. So, what would you say to this person?
Yeah, I mean, that hypervigilance is so common when we lose a client suddenly, whether it's suicide or a car accident or any other means of how that happens. And so I want to start by normalizing, like, that is such a significant part of the data I've collected, not just to write a book on this topic, but I was just like, I want to talk to my colleagues. I want to hear what happened to them. So for the last 2 years, I'm not a researcher. I'm not a doctorate level like Jenny. Like, I am just kind of nerding out over what's happening. But 200 of our mental health professional colleagues, like, submitted a survey result saying, like, hey, the top impact of any of these kind of losses was anxiety. So normal to feel hypervigilant, to be anxious, to be ruminating on who's next, which is kind of a normal thought here for this person. So I want to start there. But yeah, like, I mean, none of us have a magic ball to predict who's going to live, who's going to die, when, any of that. And so I think part of the healing process is just knowing this reaction is normal and that it takes time to kind of come down from that hypervigilance to be like, can I be back in my grounded space? Can I have my nervous system reset? Can I speak this truth in supportive groups so that like I can feel less alone about it? But yeah, there's no magic wand to be like, this will never happen again. Because I mean, humans, this is a human experience of like life and death.
And I know that this person in particular shared with me that they did have supportive supervisors and coworkers. Can you talk about the importance of that?
Yeah, yeah. So my loss when I was 3 months into the field was very similar to this reader because I know you had shared with me a little bit more offline about that circumstance. And I also was fortunate to have a really great supervisor who was like normalizing all of the feelings, let me ugly cry when I needed to. Like she had an open door policy that if her door was open and you needed to come in, like she had what we called a wailing wall where you just kind of like stand up against the wall and just like let it go. Which sounds so dramatic to put on this record, this interview, but that safety was there. Like there was no judgment. There was no, oh my gosh, Kara, you're an unprofessional therapist if you come in here and ugly cry. She helped me figure out like, was I going to attend the service for this client who died suddenly? What was I going to do with the remaining family members? Because I was doing family therapy with this particular one. And so it is so critical to have that supportive leadership. Like if we don't have that, and this is what I'm seeing with the data, like people are blowing out of this field. They're burning out. They're like, I can't do this anymore. Maybe they tell themselves, I'm not going to work with a particular population because I want to avoid this from happening. But when it's a car accident or something like that, or cancer, like I think that's more common than we can say to ourselves, I'm not working with that population. Like, I don't think we can protect ourselves from that kind of loss. The
Yeah,
leadership makes a huge
absolutely.
difference in healing and like, oh, like normalize, let's make sure that you feel okay. Let's give you some more time off if that's even feasible financially. But yeah, I'm so glad they had that supportive leadership.
What about people who don't have that kind of support?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where I feel very fortunate to have a community that I have people I can like text or call if something like this were to happen and they would hold space for me. And so I know it takes time to find your people. My close friend Alex would say that like his tribe, but like who are your people
Hmm.
that you could go and be a vulnerable human with rather than, oh my gosh, you're going to judge me. I'm apparently not a good therapist. Like we're already thinking those things depending on what kind of loss we went through. So how do we build that community? Like, does it start with connecting with people like in your platform of like, oh, we've all wanted to like heal together. Even if it takes time, how do we build those connections with people who are real and not the let's be professional, compare our credentials kind of thing?
Right, exactly. Yeah, finding spaces where we can just be human as therapists, because first and foremost, that's what we are as humans. We're people.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked about attending funerals, and that's one of the questions. So, do we attend or not? How do we make that decision? I know it always depends. There's going to be so many
Right.
variables. But what's kind of the most broad stroke recommendation or guidance that you would like to share about attending funerals or not?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer as I chuckle is it depends because there's so many nuanced factors as you named. But I invite any clinician to play it through. So, like, that's what I would do if I was in a mentorship role, if I'm working with a clinician survivor of suicide, that's something we're talking about. Even as a clinical supervisor, I'm asking that question of supervisees of like, let's play this through. If you go, what are all the things that could happen? If you don't go, what are all the things that could happen? So sometimes we're asking ourselves questions like, how would I answer the question of how do you know the deceased? Like if you go to a service, a
Yep.
memorial, a funeral, like you can't answer that question honestly. You can't be like, I was their therapist. Like, no, we're not doing that. So like even sitting in that discomfort of like, how would you navigate that? Are you prepared to navigate that? Where would you sit? Would you feel called to go up and say anything? Are you lurking in the back of the memorial space, right? So like really just like getting that visual of like, what would this really look like for you? And more often than not, people decide not to go, sometimes because of fear, sometimes because of liability, of like maybe there's an open investigation of how this person died. Maybe there's family members who blame you for what happened, even if it had nothing to do with you. And so more often I see clinicians decide not to go. And then we're talking about how can you have your own conscious healing, your own conscious closure. They might do something else on their own time that is a goodbye for that client.
Yeah, I think that That really resonates and tracks with me about oftentimes clinicians ultimately choosing not to go. And that invitation to make sure that we're having our own ritual, our own process, because as humans, when we have unfinished business, our brain starts looping and looping and looping, and we get stuck really easily because our brain's trying to find that answer, trying to find the solution. And so it can be the most simple thing, right? Writing your dear client a letter maybe, or a goodbye note, or if you are artistic, creating something, or even planting something in the ground, whatever it might be, just to give a little bit of that unfinished business a closure piece.
Absolutely. Yeah, some people, they're just like leaning into the four elements of like release something into fire or air or water or earth, as you named.
Yep.
For my clinician survivors, so those who had a client die by suicide, they're also looking at like these visual reminders that represent the work they did. Because it's very often, it's very normal for us to go, oh my gosh, all I can remember is their death, but not the work that we did or the quality of the work we did before they died. And so even like these visual prompts like art or like something they wear on their person, some of our colleagues love tattoos, so maybe they're doing something symbolic that isn't actually using the client's name. So just allowing yourself to think creatively of like what will give you conscious closure. And there's so many options.
Yeah. You also talked about some of the family stuff already. And one of the questions I got is if I'm notified by the family of the client's passing, how do I address the family?
Yeah, yeah. So I think my first curiosity question is how are you notified? So some folks get an email, and I was noticing as I interviewed colleagues on this experience, like it landed differently to get an email than it did to get a voicemail than it did to pick up the phone. Now I don't know about you, Jenny, but I
Mhm.
don't pick up my phone very often anymore for lots of reasons, especially scams that are happening to
Right,
therapists right now.
exactly.
But like I think it's rare for us to actually pick up the phone when it's an unknown number and be like, "Who is this?" And I feel like that is a very different experience of being in real time, trying to figure out how to regulate ourselves, but also going, "Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god," like a human. Versus an email or voicemail, we have a different chance to compose ourselves and figure some things out. So, how they're notified is my first curiosity question. If it is an email or a voicemail, maybe now you're seeking consultation. Maybe you're coming into your community saying, "Oh my gosh, this just happened. I'm in a shock state. Let me just like figure out how I feel before I respond." Some folks are like, "Do I even respond?" And maybe that was what this question was alluding to of like, "Do I call them back?" Um, I've had colleagues text people back saying, I really appreciate the message. I've had people call them back with like very clear parameters of why they were calling. So I think no matter what, consultation or a trusted colleague to run this by would be helpful. Kind of a rehearsal of like, what do I want this to
Mhm.
look like? What's my intention of calling them back? As a human, we want answers, right? So like we might be like, I want to know how they died or why they died or what happened, right? Very common like thought, what happened? But it's not appropriate to ask those things, right? So it's like, can I play some of that out with a colleague so I don't actually project that on the family that's grieving?
Mhm. And what are the HIPAA laws once a client or patient has passed? How does that change in terms of being able to speak to people?
Yeah, so my understanding is that they're still protected by HIPAA. So like we don't actually get to say like I acknowledge they were my client. Sometimes the person that's calling us is their emergency contact, and that's a little different, right? Because like we've gotten written permission for that person. But if it's like a stranger, I mean, I've had coroners call clinicians saying, "Hey, I'm calling because this is your client," and like that's a different professional dynamic. But it's not like we just all of a sudden get to start talking about, oh, I lost my client. Their name was John Doe, and da 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 da, right? Like it's never a free for all. And so my understanding, we should probably consult a lawyer in each state, but my understanding is like confidentiality is still respected. That's why confidential grief as a term exists. One of the reasons.
That makes so much sense. And yeah, just to highlight, always check your laws, your not only your state specific laws, but your license credential specific ethics as well, right? So, you're
Mhm.
an LPC, I'm a psychologist, social workers, LMFTs, all the things. We all have our different rules
Yeah,
depending on
they don't
our
make that easy.
degree, our state, our country, for anyone we're international, like always check for yourself.
Yep. You can always, I mean, this is why we have malpractice insurance because you can call them and even give them a theoretical like, hey, if I had a client die suddenly, what would this look like for confidentiality? So, like, you don't have to, I don't want to say out yourself, but like, I know some colleagues, that's the feeling they have. So, make it a hypothetical. Just like call your malpractice. It's part of what you get. And when you pay for malpractice, it's a couple free calls with a lawyer. And so, like, run it by them, see what they would say if it's not in your code of ethics.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you say that. That was actually one of the One of the first little like gifts that I was able to receive for running Brave, just learning about that because we had someone join in the middle of a client crisis. They joined
Mm.
Brave, and so they were reaching out for a lot of support. And another member said to them, like, just go ahead and call your malpractice because they want to prevent any kind of lawsuits against you. And the person called, and their risk avoidance or whatever department was amazing and so helpful. And it one really not only helped this person, but then they've called them again on different cases because now they feel comfortable, they feel empowered to call their malpractice. And so I think for a lot of us, it can feel like calling CPS or something, like we're going to get in trouble, it's going to be traumatic when our malpractice providers do not want us to get sued. They don't want to have to pay for that. And so they want us to call. So that's such a good recommendation.
Yeah, it's a resource people don't even know is part
I
of what they
know.
paid for. So it's like, yes, of course you can.
I know you're not paying for them to like avoid them.
Yeah.
Okay, we did have a question about rituals. We talked about some of that already. Is there anything else that you would want to share about rituals, especially in situations where we can't publicly identify or address the loss?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the kind of loss, like my biggest group of people I talk to, and you see this in this interview, is like clinician survivors of suicide, because that is like one of the most impactful losses of our career. It actually hurts us more than a loved one dying by suicide, and we can nerd out about that some other time in a different video. So those folks, it might be something as simple as like participate in a suicide prevention walk, do a dedication online, de-identify with initials or like a pseudonym or whatever that looks like. But rituals is so expansive. Like ritual can be talking to the client as if they were here, writing a letter, which you mentioned earlier. It could be eating the client's favorite food, listening to the music that they like. So, like anything with intention is what I tell people. Like anything that feels very intentional and aligned with the client. Most of the time, we're never going to forget our clients that we lose, especially when you reference them as a dear client, right? Someone that we really were invested in, maybe we knew for a long time. And that's why we're hurt so deeply by their loss, right? Because like we had such a relationship with them. And so it might be a tattoo in tribute, because I have a couple people who like to do that. Could just be envisioning the client sitting on your chair or couch and talking to them as if they were here. Like it doesn't have to be elaborate, just intentional is what's coming up.
And then I think too, it can, what's coming up for me is I'm thinking about two clients that I've lost. One of them, she loved making wreaths. And so she would
Mm.
make them for people. And she just passed a few months ago. And so I haven't had an opportunity for this to happen yet, but knowing that the holidays are coming up and all
Right.
different kinds of wreaths, I'm just now realizing that that can be part of my own honoring of her and thinking of her and remembering her when I do see wreaths or when I put ours up or when I add things to it.
Hmm.
The other client I talked about earlier, who I learned about her passing after I wasn't working with her anymore, she was a gluten-free baker, like had her own bakery. And so I had already still thought of her all the time when it came to gluten-free kind of baking and goods and
Right.
stuff. And so it can be this ongoing thing of those reminders that we get to have throughout our lives then of these people who have touched us just as much as we've, impacted them.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes, I mean, this is going to sound surprising, I think, to some of the audience, but like for the folks that do go to a memorial service, which they're few and far between, but when they have, it has been a beautiful opportunity for closure. And sometimes they're given a token by the family. So I think there's this pervasive fear that the family's going to blame us when our client dies. I mean, when it's car accident or something like that, that feels very disconnected from blame. But like when it comes to mental health crisis, overdose, or like suicide, we worry about that. But the few folks that I have had the honor of working alongside to help them heal that went to a service, they were given something, a possession
Mm.
of the client. And that felt very significant to them. Like whether they put that somewhere safe or like had it on display with other losses in their household. It felt very significant to those people. So just wanted to add that in here too, of like sometimes it's an unexpected thing that somehow gets to you outside of like the gluten-free thinking of them, or my client had a memorial where their car accident was for a while. So like I saw their name in public all the
Mhm.
time, and like flowers were left there and stuff. There's just lots of ways
Yeah.
this could go.
Yep. Okay, last question. How does one know when they're ready to return to client work with other clients if time off is a privilege held?
Yeah, I was gonna say it definitely feels like a privilege. Like most of us financially can't stop working. Um, 3 days of bereavement is not it, but like
Right.
most of us don't have other options. And so I think this shows up organically too for folks where sometimes they just like it strikes them as they're like taking on a new client that they didn't hyper vigilant response or like hyperventilate about, oh my gosh, this person's also got a similar background to the client I lost, for example. Um, I think it's a felt sense. I don't think there's like any one thing I'm looking for when I'm working with those survivors. Like I'm just listening to their story and like how they showed up. And maybe they're saying, oh my gosh, I was so surprised. I worked with another client with active suicidality and was not panicked. And I'm like, that's
Mhm.
fantastic. But it almost feels like exposure, right? Like you have to almost like
Yep.
be in it to realize like I can handle this or I can't handle this. And when it comes to suicide, like suicide is a human experience. So like I always kind of scoff at the colleagues who are like, I don't work with suicide. And I'm like, uh-huh, you sure you don't.
Right.
Um, so side note there. But yeah, I feel like so many of the clinicians I've talked to don't have the financial privilege of taking time off. And so I feel like, unfortunately, most of us are like thrown back into the fire before we're ready. And so then it's about utilizing all the coping skills you would give to a client of like, how do I regulate? How do I breathe? How do I do mindfulness or a ritual to drop into therapeutic work and then turn it off when I'm off the clock? Um, and then eventually find those pieces of progress, like the evidence of like,
Mm.
oh, I'm less hypervigilant. Oh, I didn't over ask if this client was suicidal. I didn't hold my breath when my client said they were diagnosed with cancer. I didn't hold my breath at this part where the person died in a car accident. Like just noticing those things, but usually it's after the fact, not before.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. And I think also, coming back to the community piece of knowing who are the colleagues that you can lean on, not only for support, but to help give you the feedback about those little moments of progress. Because just like with our clients, with the people we serve, they aren't always able to see the little bits of progress that they're making, but we see it because we're trained, because we know what we're looking for. And because we just have the space to be able to view things in a different light than our clients. And so our colleagues can do that for us as well and reflect those things back. And it can make a really big difference in situations like this.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely one of the joys of working with these folks is like holding up that metaphorical mirror and being like, look how different you are in this moment versus like in the thick of the shock and the grief and the loss. But yeah, I feel like there's no timeline on grief. There's no timeline of I'll be better now, right? Like just like there's no timeline for our clients. So I think we are really hard on ourselves of like, oh, I should be over this by now. And it's like one of the first things I say is like, you'll never forget this client ever,
Yeah.
ever. And like just let them sit in that sadness of like, you're right, I'll never forget him for the good, the bad, and the ugly. But then how do we remember all the goodness that happened before they died? And that's, I think, the biggest growth edge for these folks in grief is they're like, all I can think of, whether I had an actual imagery or not, like all I can think of is how they died.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, that's grief, right? No matter who it is, we have this like last snapshot of the person. It's like, but how do we get back to the stuff that was happening before, the stuff that
Hmm.
was worthwhile?
Yeah. This has been so incredibly helpful. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your time. Are there any last words? That was a beautiful place to finish, but I just wanted to check in and see if there was any kind of final thoughts that you want to share, and then we'll tell people how to find you and reach out and learn about the book too.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think just from this lens of community, I'm so grateful you've built community. I feel like there's plenty of opportunity to build additional communities. The more I talk about this freely, the more the community tends to open up and tell me, like, that's me, or that's my colleague, or I know someone who had this happen. And the data is reflecting that too, right? So, like, it's more common than grad schools are naming, which that's my own little agenda. I'm going towards grad schools saying, let's fix that, let's normalize that, let's prepare them before it happens. But like build community, find your community, find someone who is showing up in authenticity who will say, yes, I've had a client loss and here's how I showed up and here's how it was for me. And allow that to be your roadmap of like, can I take on some of that wisdom? So if and when I go through a loss, I don't feel like this is completely out of left field or that I'm not normal. Like every response is normal. OCD is normal, hypervigilance is normal, anxiety is normal, avoidance is normal, compartmentalization is normal. I'm doing this motion, right? Like all of it is normal, and community helps us heal it because we hear, oh, it's not just me. So please, please find your community, whether it's in the Brave community or any other community that's going to pop out in the next few years because of all of this. I think that's a huge piece of healing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now, where can people find you, and then how can they learn about the book when it comes out?
Yeah. So all of my serial entrepreneur projects are on my website. So crosswaycounselingplc.com. The book is called The Resilient Therapist: Healing from Career Altering Adverse Psychological Events, I think is our subtitle. I don't have a pretty cover or anything yet, but stay tuned for
That's
that.
okay.
That's co-written with my wonderful colleague, Ashley Charbonneau. So licensed social worker, licensed LPC right here, doing that work together. And so hopefully the book will be out, but in the meantime, come on my website and find all the other books I've written on loss and all sorts of things for therapists. I'd love to be a support.
Wonderful. We will link to your website in the notes below. You also have a YouTube channel, right?
I do.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yep.
we
I'm a
will link.
therapist. All I do.
Yep, we
All
will
I do
link
now
to
is
that
therapist.
too. So go and subscribe to Khara on YouTube. Make sure that you check out her videos. She does really amazing interviews and has just so much helpful content out there for therapists.
No, thank
So
you.
thank you again. I so appreciate you, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.